Anyone who plays D&D probably already knows about the certified good boy holier-than-thou family of metallic dragons, and their counterpart, the self-proclaimed bad boy village-raising, horde-stealing, countryside-burninating family of chromatic dragons. But very few are likely familiar with the draconic family that adheres to neither good nor evil, but to law. The ferrous dragons. Unless you're a regular viewer of this channel, in which case you already know about ferrous dragons, and you're also probably really handsome and smart. Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that digs up old creatures from past editions of D&D, talks about why they're cool, comes up with some ideas about how we could use them in a campaign, and converts them to 5th edition. Today we're delving into yet another member of the ferrous dragon family tree, the Cobalt dragon. If you haven't already seen my video about iron dragons, I'd suggest watching that one first because I go over a lot of the details about the ferrous dragon family tree, and that's all stuff I'm not going to repeat here today. But if you've already seen that video, or you're just some kind of freak who likes to get lore delivered to them in reverse order, settle in and prepare to learn everything there is to know about one of the cruelest draconic creatures to ever walk the material plane. Visually, Cobalt dragons have large heads, long teeth, smaller than average horns, and beady red eyes. Their bodies are covered in midnight blue scales, and what's probably their most distinct feature, their tail, is extremely long and almost rope-like, sort of like a rat.
That's the normal rat!
Like all ferrous dragons, Cobalt dragons got their start in Dragon Magazine issue 170. Also like all ferrous dragons, the two other times they would show up across all of D&D history would be in Dragon Magazine 365, where they were updated for 3rd edition, and the Metallic Dragon Dracnomicon, where they were updated for 4th edition. As members of the ferrous family tree, they are of course part of the ferrous dragon hierarchy, finding themselves smack in the middle with tungsten and nickel dragons below them, leaving iron and chromium dragons above them. Also, like all the other ferrous dragons, they are lawful in nature. However, the other side of their alignment chart is much different than any of the other ferrous family members we've discussed thus far. Cobalt dragons are straight up evil, and strength is the primary lens through which they see the entire world. Anytime they meet another creature, the first thing they do is attempt to size them up and place them into one of 3 categories. They will either be considered a superior, an equal, or a lesser. And they don't give a shit about nobility or status, nothing like that. This assessment is purely calculated based on empirical evidence of strength. Basically, they will consider another creature superior to them if that creature can force them to do what they want through violence. They'll consider you an equal if the fight could maybe go either way, and they will consider this creature to be lesser than them if they can force their will upon that other creature using violence. For a creature like a dragon, that means there are very few other beings on the material plane that they consider equal or above them for that matter. And this wouldn't be such a big deal if it weren't for the fact that Cobalt dragons will use the immense power afforded them to subjugate and oppress basically every living thing they encounter that is not able to defend themselves. So if one of these guys moves into your kingdom and you're not able to force them out, it is 100% going to smash your walls, burn your fields, and declare itself the ruler of your people. And anyone who disagrees with that course of action is super invited to come do something about it. That might sound a lot like the kind of behavior we've seen from red dragons in the past, and yeah, but the key difference here is that red dragons have an ego, a superiority complex. Cobalt dragons do calculations. A red dragon might fight literally to the death because it refuses to accept that anyone or anything might be better than it in some way. Cobalt dragons have no interest in dying for the sake of preserving their pride. If a cobalt dragon is faced with odds it doesn't like, it's simply gonna just relent.
I'm sorry, who put this fight together? This is just, if y'all got an actual crazy person for me to fight, well, that's not fair to me. Or him.
And to see evidence of this, one only needs to look at the established ferrous dragon hierarchy. They will absolutely assert their authority over tungsten and nickel dragons whenever they can, but if an iron or chromium dragon comes calling with a command, they will listen. They won't be happy about it, but they're not about to break rank and attempt mutiny, especially not one they're very likely to die in the attempt of. So the good news is, if you ever find yourself up against a cobalt dragon, just be stronger than it, or at the very least, put yourself on equal footing. Easy, right? And you would think a creature like this might be excessively violent, but the odd thing about this mentality is that because they are so calculated in their actions, they very rarely find themselves in a place where they actually have to fight. They're either following commands of more powerful creatures, or they're the ones doing the commanding. However, that third category of creatures who are equivalent to the dragon in strength does exist, and while it may be the slimmest of the three categories, it's also where all the drama lies. When a Cobalt dragon finds itself matched up against a genuine equal, it will do everything in its power to skew the playing field to its advantage, and this means setting traps, utilizing minions, taking advantage of what magic or powerful magic items it can find. Literally anything they can do to get a claw up on their opponent, whatever advantage they can sniff out, is something they're gonna do. Speaking of sniffing, do you smell blood? Hello and welcome to Monster of the Midroll, the only show on the internet that puts a Monster of the Week in your Monster of the Week. Have you ever wondered what a vampiric dragon who enjoys bathing in the blood of his enemies might look like? Well, wonder no more, because Voragil is here to liberate your blood from your body. This bad boy is only one of the many grave lords included in the book from this week's sponsor, Erevin's Guide to Death and Beyond. This upcoming 5e tome is all about bringing brand new dark magics, unholy monsters, craftable items, and incredible boss fights to your D&D table. It contains over 10 new scalable mega bosses, each with their own profane lair, 75 unholy monsters, 12 new insidious subclasses, 50 craftable items, 40 new spells, and 6 player races. There are also some new really cool looking mechanics on how to deal with character death and resurrection. Maybe you'll return to life as an undying creature, or perhaps a soul caught between two worlds. Or maybe you'll take advantage of the new undead grafting system, which enables characters to wield the powers of the undying to combat death with more death, harnessing the very essence of the afterlife itself. And if you're not sure where to start out with all this stuff, the Kickstarter even includes a level 1 to 10 adventure that starts with a TPK. So maybe next time the dice gods decide it's time to bury your campaign 6 feet under, you don't let it go quietly into the night, but instead, you get your shovel and make your players fight for the very essence of their soul. The artwork for this book is amazing, the mechanics are intriguing, and I can tell you firsthand that the miniatures are extremely detailed and very high quality. So if any of that even remotely piques your interest, I highly encourage you to click the link in the description down below and check it out for yourself. This project is live on Kickstarter right now for a limited time, and they've got tons of awesome stretch goals, a lot of which are already unlocked, and plenty of pledge options to fit all budgets. And trust me, it's not one you're gonna wanna miss out on. Thank you so much to Erevin's Guide to Death and Beyond for bringing us here this week to talk about a draconic horror of our own. And speaking of, once you get your hands on Erevin's Guide, you might need a draconic rival or unlikely ally to help you in the fight against the vampiric dragon Voragil. Or perhaps you just really want to make your players aware of how dangerous dragons can be. In either case, I think it's time for us to move on and talk about just exactly what makes Cobalt dragons so deadly. Surprising no one, this dragon can do all the dragon stuff, such as biting, attacking with its claws and wings, and its massive rope-like tail, and being scary. But what I'm sure you all want to know about is the breath weapon. What's this guy working with? My version of this monster has 2 of them, but the sordid history of this dragon's breath weapon is so weird. It's kind of changed and adapted in every incarnation of this creature, so I just decided to go with what I thought was cool and interesting. The first breath weapon at its disposal is a long line of magnetic force that does, you guessed it, force damage to anyone in its path, and has the potential to push them away in a direction of the dragon's choosing, pending a failed save. This attack is not only a great damage option, but it also provides a good deal of battlefield control for the dragon, and being able to move other creatures around the battle map is something I love in a monster encounter, especially if it can push them into hazards and traps, which, as we've already established, the dragon is likely to set. Its other breath attack, Rhyme Death Fog, is a real doozy, and it does a bunch of stuff. This breath weapon is a cone of sickly blue fog that does an unhealthy amount of both poison and cold damage to anyone trapped within. Additionally, if you fail to save by 5 or more, you're poisoned, and while poisoned in this way, you're also deafened. The deafened condition is just a little thing I added on there to spice up this breath weapon a little bit, because it also plays with the idea that cobalt poisoning can make you go deaf in real life, so we've got that kind of crossover between science and dragons. And the deafen condition isn't particularly punishing in D&D. Essentially, it just means you automatically fail any checks that rely on being able to hear, which makes sense. But what it does mean is that aside from any obvious communication difficulties that might occur, you won't be able to hear your allies yell out in combat. How important that actually ends up being is going to vary from table to table as well as from encounter to encounter, depending on what the situation is. But it would be a really great opportunity for one of the dragon's stealthier minions to sneak up behind you while you can't hear it and stab you in the back of the neck. For the DMs watching, I'm definitely not saying you should totally have a league of assassins ready to ambush the players once half of them go deaf, but I mean, you could totally do that, and I think it would be sick. But aside from its breath weapon, the only other little quirk you're gonna see on this creature's stat block is that it has the amphibious trait, allowing it to go both in and out of the water as much as it likes for as long as it wants. So keep that in mind when choosing where the dragon might build its lair. And speaking of the dragon's lair, Cobalt dragons live in thick jungles and overgrown forests. They love the heat and humidity that often comes with such places and will make lairs within natural cave structures or in tunnels beneath the gnarled roots of the forest above. This naturally puts them at odds with both green and orange dragons who also prefer such locales. But fortunately for the Cobalt dragon, unless dealing with an older or magically more powerful chromatic rival, they will often come out on top of such engagements. When it comes to the dragon's actual horde, Cobalt dragons will greedily collect anything and everything that either represents their dominance over the region or empowers them to exert that dominance even further. Magical weapons, scrolls, potions, and all manner of other power sources are at the top of the list when a Cobalt dragon goes pillaging. However, something they would also consider part of their horde, and therefore their possessions, are the other creatures that they dominate. Whether it be a local barbarian tribe, a conquered city, or other monstrous creatures cowed into service by the dragon, all such creatures are seen by the Cobalt dragons as its belongings. And for the most part, that super sucks. Even the most violent, monstrous creature isn't going to be happy in an arrangement where they're forced to do the bidding of another creature, but this does mean that if anyone should kill or otherwise harm one of the dragon's subjects, they have essentially stolen from the dragon's horde, and we all know how that usually ends. So if you have a particularly powerful Cobalt dragon who has taken over the rulership of, say, a kingdom, and another kingdom should declare war on them, this warmongering kingdom might have bitten off a bit more than they can chew. But the protection granted by this possessive tyrant mentality is merely the tiniest of silver linings on a whole-ass tropical storm cloud of oppression. For younger dragons, this domineering nature might manifest as them simply taking over a small bandit gang or a group of kobolds living in a cave. In fact, I don't really know where else to mention this, so I'm going to mention it here. There are some tenuous scraps of lore that point to Cobalt dragons as being the first draconic creatures to ever make use of kobolds as minions. I feel like that's gotta just be a joke based on how similar their names sound, especially if you're using a bunch of Cobalt kobolds, but it's in the canon. And while domineering over a band of kobolds may be fine for a young dragon, an ancient Cobalt dragon is going to be operating on a scale of tyranny unseen by most regions of the material plane, probably ever. A being like that isn't going to be satisfied with a simple group of followers. We're talking emperor-level war crime shenanigans. Just a massive, powerful creature who holds dominion over a huge part of the world and is constantly expanding out in all directions until either they reach the end of the world or they meet something that they can't conquer. Which brings me to my next point of conversation. Something I really love about Cobalt dragons is that due to their tendency towards domination, they're basically just hated by all other dragons. Even other ferrous dragons just kind of tolerate them. Those below them on the chain of command see Cobalt dragons as giant assholes, and those above them see the dragons as sort of pathetic, like they're loudmouth kids who constantly feel the need to assert how in charge they are all the time.
Any man who must say, "I am the king," is no true king.
But even beyond dragonkind, Cobalt dragons are not particularly well liked by anyone, and why would they be? They're warmongers who either make things difficult for you or outright want to enslave you, and either way, that's probably not someone you want to hang out with. But one thing that I do think is important to keep in mind here that I mentioned earlier is these dragons are calculated. They don't simply snap into a rage when things don't go their way. I mean, they're not going to be happy when things don't go their way, but they don't typically let emotion rule their decision making. Instead, they find ways to gain the upper hand or simply move on to greener pastures if that's not possible. So with all that in mind, something to consider if you're going to put a Cobalt dragon in your world is how might they interact with the other powers at play? One story idea that I think is really interesting is the players coming across a Cobalt dragon egg. Maybe they find it, or maybe they've been tasked with transporting it by someone who's paying a lot of money to eventually hatch this dragon egg and study it. So they travel for weeks with this egg, fighting off bandits and members of some group who seem obsessed with destroying it, only to find out that this egg belongs to a species of dragon thought to be extinct, and the group dedicated to the egg's destruction is doing so because they know that whatever is sleeping inside that shell is no good for everyone else. I mean, sure, a wormling is no major threat, but if allowed to exist and grow and thrive and get stronger, this thing could pose a threat to the world as we know it eventually. So you could hit him with the old helpless baby creature that might grow up to be a terrible monster trope. Or for something more dragon-centric, maybe we're living in a world where a Cobalt dragon has already taken over the kingdom that the players are from. It's just a fact of life that everyone in this part of the world will live and die in service of the great Cobalt Dragon King. Of course, until your players take it upon themselves to join the resistance and cut his head off. If you've ever wanted to run a regicide campaign, making the regicide in question a literal dragon could be a great way to spice up that idea. For something less directly violent, I also really like the idea of the party and the Cobalt dragons kind of butting heads as peers. If the dragon sizes them up, either through combat or intuition, and deems them dangerous enough to the point that it won't pick a fight, that could result in some really cool story beats. The dragon will of course be poking and prodding for weakness, just looking for a way to put them in their place the entire time. But if they're willing to cooperate with the dragon, perhaps it pays them well to complete some sort of task. Maybe it hires them to go steal some green dragon eggs for it, offering a powerful magic item for every egg that they can net. A dragon egg heist is always a good time, and of course the reason the Cobalt dragon wants these eggs is so that it can raise the hatchlings as little minions of its own. And speaking of dragon egg hatchlings, one other little detail about these creatures that I think is both hilarious and kind of wholesome is that they're actually really good parents. They don't mate often, but when they do, the two parents will stick around, merging their territories until the wormlings are grown up enough to go off and fend for themselves. At which point they are promptly kicked from the nest and the two parents go back to whatever they were doing beforehand. But during the child-rearing years, they go out of their way to teach their young everything they will need to survive and dominate a territory of their own someday. Now, if you want to use the dragon as more of a looming threat and not necessarily something the players are interacting with directly, perhaps the players are all from this land that is dominated by an ancient Cobalt dragon, and their goal is not to kill him, but rather escape the lands that he controls, getting a chance to go off and live a proper life somewhere else. That might not be as heroic as killing a tyrant, but if we're talking about an ancient dragon and a bunch of level 1 characters, it might be all they can hope for, at least until they're strong enough to come back and cut its head off. Or maybe the players are outsiders and they're simply trying to help another creature escape the clutches of the Cobalt dragon overlord, maybe a young gold dragon who is kidnapped from the nest and is being used as this minion of a much more powerful and much older dragon. So the players have to do this whole escape thing where they go in, make a plan, and try to get out with this little wormling. I mean, it could even be a young dragon, honestly. The disparity in power levels between ancient and young is crazy. And it doesn't even have to be a dragon they're trying to help either. It could be some other magical creature with an ability that the dragon is leveraging, such as a divination wizard or a unicorn or something. But at the end of the day, no matter how you choose to use this creature, I hope it eventually finds a spot at your table and you have a group of adventurers who are up to the task of kicking his ass. Because these guys are just such little blue jerks. In any case, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. As always, if you want to use this monster in your game, link to the description down below is a Google document that contains all the stats and lore and information you will need to bring this dragon to the table. And if you're one of my lovely patrons, over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon page, you will find the high-res PDF of this monster, which contains all the same information, but it's presented in a little bit more of a fanciful way. It's got all the new artwork from Maxwell Polikoff this week, who did an amazing job. I love the idea he came up with, contrasting this creature's relationship with a chicken versus the Platinum Dragon's relationship with the chickens, because those two images just really show what these dragons are about, even at a young age. and I love that. But speaking of patrons, it is time for Patron of the Week. This week's randomly selected patron is Ooga Booga Boo. I love that username. Thank you so much for the scary amount of support you throw my way each month. It means the most. And thank you for watching. As always, if there is a monster you'd like to see show up in an episode of Monster of the Week from an older edition of Dungeons & Dragons, or any other tabletop role-playing game for that matter, let me know in the comments down below, or over on the Dungeon Dad Discord, and who knows, you might just see it show up on an episode of Monster of the Week. In terms of housekeeping stuff, there's a couple things I want to talk to you guys about. I know in our last video, the preview said we were doing the Chia Golem this week, and instead we ended up doing this horrible evil dragon, and that's not the same thing. I apologize for the confusion. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Chia Golem episode is still coming. The short version of this story is that my production schedule just got very, very, very messed up because of a lot of travel delays. I was at Green Dragon Fest this month, which was awesome. If I got a chance to DM for you there, thanks for playing in my games. It was a ton of fun. I had a good time. Hopefully you had a good time, but I thought it was great. And I was also helping my partner move her stuff from central United States, Midwest America to East Coast Canada, which we did by car. And those two trips had travel delays, both going and coming back in both cases, which resulted in me losing a ton of time. So I apologize just in general that content has been kind of slow this month, but that's also the reason why we're talking about a dragon right now and not a beautiful, adorable, cute little Chia creature, which we're gonna do next. So it's still coming. That also means there's no next time segment this week because we still haven't done the thing we said we were doing next last time, and I didn't want to just tack on the same thing to the end of this video. So point is, once the credits are done, I got nothing for you. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, which will probably be the Chia Golem video. So look forward to that. Hopefully we should be able to get back on a more regularly scheduled video production release schedule. Every time I say that, something insane happens and it just doesn't work out, so maybe I should cut this. Anyways, I'll see you next time. Till then.